So there was a big peace summit involving 90 countries in Switzerland the past weekend to try to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine and bring an end to the conflict there. The idea was to get enough countries together to pledge their support for Ukraine so that Russia would have to just accept that its invasion of the country has failed.
Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
80 of the countries that attended signed the final communique calling for the territorial integrity of Ukraine to be the foundation of any peace agreement to end the war. The summit was Ukraine initiated. Putin wasn't invited and China decided not to send anyone. India, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were among 10 countries that did not sign the final communique, but 80 did. The Ukrainian foreign minister says Kiev is willing to talk to Moscow. Here's how Radio Free Europe reported that.
Well, that's the idea, that the next summit should be the end of the war and should mean the end of the war. And of course, we need the other side to be at the table. I cannot tell you when the war will end. It's not in my hands. But I know that we are making some major steps towards restoring just and lasting peace. These are two key words, just and lasting, not peace at any expense.
A just and lasting peace, not peace at any expense, he says. I'm wondering how much more expense either side can handle. The human toll of this war has been obscene for two so-called modern European nations who consider themselves advanced. It's utterly shameful. I know it's kind of cool these days to point to Western corruption in Ukraine, particularly US corruption, as if that can excuse Putin marching across the border of a sovereign country. Putin is an illegitimate dictator of an authoritarian communist state. He's not a democratically elected leader of a liberal democracy. He's a murderer and he bumps off his political opponents in true Soviet KGB style. All the mafia stuff that all good people should still detest, even while recognising the flaws and corruption in our own countries and our own imperfections. We can also sympathise with the fact that the deal was always, after the Cold War ended, that the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to Russia would not happen. And Putin doesn't want NATO right on his western border, thanks very much. But this war has been a major failure for Putin, a huge error of judgment and an act of obscene arrogance. He sent hundreds of thousands of his country's young men to the slaughter in the name of ego and hubris. Of the 600,000 plus lives lost in this shameful global catastrophe, it's likely as many as 500,000 are Russian. In its third year of the war, Russia now controls about 1/5 of Ukrainian territory. The original invasion plan was to take Kiev within weeks. And that didn't turn out so well. On the day before the peace conference last Friday, Putin laid out his latest proposal for an end to the war.
But it comes with a laundry list of conditions. The Russian leader is demanding that Kyiv withdraw all forces from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia in eastern and southern Ukraine, 4 regions annexed by Moscow in 2022.
That report from Canada's City News Network. Russia is, of course, also insisting that the Ukraine halts any plans to join NATO permanently. But the Ukraine called the offer manipulative and absurd, while the US Defense Secretary had this to say.
He is not in any position to dictate to Ukraine what they must do to bring about a peace.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says Putin himself could end the conflict by removing troops from Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Anyway, at least things seem to be moving in the right direction. So how does all of this affect Australia? Well, first we need to understand how it affects Russia. Peter Zeihan is an American author and expert in geopolitics. He holds degrees in political science and is the author of the bestsellers The Absent Superpower, Disunited Nations, and The End of the World is Just Beginning. He spoke to the UK Times newspaper's Times Radio about the risks that Russia faces if it loses more troops in this war.
Keep in mind, the Russians have 8 million men in their 20s, or at least that's what they started the war with. If they've lost 500,000 now, and 1 million have fled, that still leaves them with 6.5 million bodies to throw at this problem. And to be perfectly blunt, the Russians have yet to fully mobilize. Most of the people that they've brought in through their draft system have been minorities from ethnically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged areas. They haven't really gotten into the core of what the country is capable of. That's still ahead of us. But at this rate, there's no way the Russians can keep this up for another 8 years. And I know that sounds like a long time. It is. But remember two things. Number one, the Russians never fight short wars. They do short intimidations. Their wars are always long because they're always about human waves. Number two, if they do this, this is their last war, because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done.
That's Peter Zihan, American author and expert in geopolitics on the UK's Times Radio there. So again, what has all this got to do with Australia? Well, if Russia completely depletes its ability to mount an army, that is very bad news for China. Here's how the popular infographics show YouTube channel explains it.
From a strategic point of view, China would be very lonely on the world stage. The loss of Russia as a serious partner and deterrent to the West would shift the balance of power away from China. China would be left with Iran and North Korea as the top allies against the United States, Great Britain, and all of NATO. A situation like this is something that she is desperately trying to avoid.
Indeed. You see, China is heavily reliant upon Russia for its military strength.
With how the Chinese handled the Tiananmen Square situation in 1989, China has been under an arms embargo and hasn't been able to buy or sell anything of military value to the West ever since. This newfound Chinese military-industrial complex has only accelerated under President Xi, who stresses Chinese self-sufficiency and seems likely to continue down that path. Their partnership with Russia continues to get deeper and deeper, bleeding into all sectors of the economy.
Without global clout, China's huge Belt and Road initiative to build global trade supremacy would be thrown into turmoil. Its persecution and incarceration of more than 1 million ethnic minority Uyghur Muslims will finally meet international resistance that it should, and their plans to take over Taiwan will be severely curtailed. All of that takes a lot of pressure off Australia geopolitically, so it would be a plus. But it also means that China may suffer economically, which would impact us negatively economically, in the short term at least.
The Taiwanese defense is outfitted with state-of-the-art radar systems, as well as some assistance from the U.S. government's satellites and drones. If everything is operational, they'll see any invasion coming from a long way off. The only real chance the PLA has here is a coordinated strike with cyber attacks that blind Taiwan and the U.S. radar and reconnaissance devices. If PLA troops were able to make it ashore, they would face a fortress of defensive works. The Taiwanese have spent the last few decades rearming and preparing to defend their island against what seems like an inevitable invasion. Another major roadblock to Chinese ambition is the United States' bases and forces, which are always within striking distance of Taiwan. The United States military has several bases around Taiwan in countries such as the Philippines and Japan. In 2014, the U.S. signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, with the Philippine government, which allowed the U.S. to build 9 military bases, rotate troops through the country, and train local forces. Japan has a similar agreement, and the U.S. has about 20 bases currently in the country. More recently, U.S. Special Forces units have been rotating through some of the small islands surrounding Taiwan.
It's a mystery to me why China's President Xi is so obsessed with taking Taiwan. I mean, who cares? If we all just get on with business and trade, everyone will prosper. Let's hope common sense prevails in Beijing. But in the end, nobody can really know what Russia or China will do, nor how Putin might react if things get very bad for him. Did you know lots of Aussie YouTubers have to make American content to survive? We want to keep producing Aussie news, and to do that, we need your direct help. If you'd like to advertise on our show, please get in touch in the comments below or DM us on Twitter. Our Australian content means we deliver mostly an Aussie audience. Or if you'd just like to help us with a donation, please click on the Super Thanks button that's with the little $sign right under the video frame just here. Or just click the subscribe button and bell. That's free and it helps a lot.